It's been 10 years since two men broke out of Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, in the North Country. Today we speak with Lucy Lane, the new Inspector General since then, but we go back 10 years about her thoughts on the report that was issued then and what she's looking to discover now. Thanks always for listening and watching. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts, so make sure to subscribe today, or you can watch on YouTube at CBS 6 Albany. Inspector General Lucy Lane does join us now, 10 years after the breakout in Clinton Correctional Facility. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Tom. Thank you.
So we do come under the 10-year anniversary, if you want to call it that, of the escape from Clinton Correctional in Dannemora. And I know the Inspector General's office was definitely involved in sort of looking at some of the circumstances behind all of this. First, you personally, and I will say you will be moderating a panel coming up here next week with a lot of the big stakeholders here, officials that were there at the time. Before I get to that, I want to ask you personally, how did you see this? I guess, where were you in life at that point, and how are you following this as it all played out over the course of those few weeks in June back in 2015?
I personally was a homicide prosecutor in New York City at the time. I was expecting my second child, and I was watching the news vigilantly, as so much of New York State was, and indeed the nation. But I never could have guessed that I would find myself in the position to inherit the office that handled really what is the most comprehensive analysis of how that escape came to be.
Yeah, and how do you think, when you stepped into this role and you see, how comprehensive, 150 something pages, is that right? Is that what it was? And 100 and I think 150 on there. And you step into this role now. I guess you look at the work that was done there. What was your reaction to seeing just how detailed it was at that point 10 years ago?
What I think is most remarkable, looking back after 10 years on this catastrophic and potentially extremely dangerous event in New York State history, is first how much New Yorkers really rallied around the efforts to locate the folks who had escaped from Clinton Correctional Facility. There were thousands of law enforcement on the ground in and around Plattsburgh, Monroe County, and we had state troopers sleeping in gymnasiums. And it was the people of these local communities who were providing food and water. Evidently, they were on Father's Day, came and folks volunteered to cut all the troopers' hair. People were working around the clock to try to locate these two very dangerous men. And the public really rallied in support of government to help make that happen. Then the other piece that is so moving to me as Inspector General is that this office did the best of what oversight should do in instances like this. It did a holistic, unbiased, comprehensive investigation into how this disaster had come to pass. And then it reported on it to the public.
Yeah, and obviously this is something you do all the time, not necessarily with this kind of a story, but can you take me inside what goes into an investigation like this? What are the resources used? Who do you talk to? What do you look into? What goes into it?
Well, there were really two simultaneous investigations happening at this time. There was the manhunt, and it was the state police, federal staff, Canadian mounted police, all kinds of folks who were on the ground looking for the men who had escaped. And then in parallel, there was the investigation into how on earth two people managed to escape from a maximum security prison of the nature of Clinton Correctional. And so our staff, along with other law enforcement partners, were at the prison, in the community, talking to hundreds of staff members, talking to hundreds of incarcerated people, and identifying how it was that these two folks who were incarcerated for murder managed to acquire the tools to break out of their cells, to climb into the basement and the steam facilities, to hacksaw into a steam pipe once the steam turned off for the summer, and then ultimately to shimmy their way through a long steam pipe journey and escape through a manhole on the outside of the prison walls. And if you have been up to Clinton, you'll know that it is dead center in the middle of the town, that the main street is built around the prison, and that when they emerged, they're in a neighborhood and in fact were spotted. So it does reflect how many things had to go wrong on the prison side in order for them to make their way out.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting what this office and you look at reports like this kind of provide, and someone might on the outside look at this and say, well, they were two, as it was stated, master manipulators that were able to work this out, and a civilian that was complicit in this as well. You might say, well, how do you even oversee that, right? Because they were so conniving, I guess you could say at the end of the day. But like as mentioned here, there's systemic failures and there's so much more than meets the eye, right? And that's kind of what reports like this provide.
Well, you point rightly to the unauthorized relationship that they had with a civilian staff member who ran the tailor shop where they were both working in industry. And that relationship, which developed over many months, resulted in her smuggling in various supplies that they used to effectuate their escape. But she couldn't have smuggled those things in if she had been following prison protocols. And so, what we found in our analysis was that she was circumventing magnetometers. She was not being searched when she entered the facility, as all staff should be. But then the additional security lapses that occurred once they started constructing their escape plan were equally outrageous. They included the fact that that guards were not doing their nightly rounds, or that they were pre-filling out the forms, claiming that they had done a count when they in fact hadn't. They were not appropriately searching cells to look for contraband, in which case they would have turned up the supplies that were being used and the tools that the tunnel was being constructed with. So it was a series of major security breaches.
Right, and that's part of what that report found at the end of the day, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course, we believe deeply here in the importance of all staff at corrections facilities, correctional staff and civilian staff alike, in treating incarcerated people with dignity. But there has to be a line maintained, and that line was breached over and over and over again to extremely dangerous effect.
Yeah, I know after the fact, of course, what the IG's office found, there was ways for docs to implement and make sure that some of these things were shored up. But since that time, this office has done more investigations into docs to see exactly what was going on there, even in recent years. I guess, can you speak to it all, what has been addressed, what still needs to be at this point?
Many of the systemic issues that we identified were addressed immediately, such as insisting on staff searches, requiring that incarcerated people who are moving from one section of the prison to another, especially a section where they may have access to tools, that they do go through a magnetometer to make sure they have not secreted any tools on their body on their way back to their facility. There has been a great deal more scrutiny on things like nightly cell checks and routine cell searches. So all of those things have dramatically improved across the system. And what we think about now is really how can we take those lessons of the critical nature of security in facilities and at the same time make sure that everyone who is incarcerated in New York State is treated with the respect and dignity that they deserve and is granted the programming and opportunities that they deserve for when they ultimately return back to their community. Because unlike the two escapees in this case, who were never to come home, most members of the incarcerated population will be coming home to our communities, and we want to equip them to be productive members of our communities.
Of course, this comes at a time 10 years later when the video of Robert Brooks comes out and creates a lot of fervor around the prison system. You had a strike that also happened, an illegal Wildcat strike at that. Where does all of that fall now in this conversation about New York's prison system when you look at the context of what happened 10 years ago?
It reflects a system that is under tremendous stress, and reasonably so. It is a system that contains some of the most vulnerable New Yorkers, in some instances, some dangerous New Yorkers, and it requires a tremendous amount of staff to operationalize. And those staff are working under very challenging circumstances. So building a system that recognizes the humanity of people behind bars, whether they're incarcerated or they're employed, is an ongoing and critically important step for our generation to take as leaders.
Yeah, let's now look at the panel here coming up next week. What do you want to learn from that? Who's involved? And what do you hope to see come out of that conversation?
I'm so thrilled that we are bringing together for the first time since the escape the then Superintendent of State Police, Joseph D'Amico, the then Commissioner of the Department of Corrections, Anthony Annucci, and Keisha Puhi, who was on the ground covering it as a journalist at the time and is also a Plattsburgh native. So I think it is going to be a really interesting and deep conversation into how the two parallel investigations unfolded. We'll also be joined with introductory remarks from my predecessor, former Inspector General and now Judge Kathy Leahy Scott, who has deserves so much credit for leading this office in developing what is really a shining example of an oversight agency working at its absolute best. And I can't conclude without saying how remarkably proud I am to lead many members of this team who are still with our office, and to thank them and the folks who have departed for what is an incredibly rigorous investigation that sets the standard for what an IG's office can do and should be.
Is there any thing that you're curious about, a topic you want to you're curious to pose to these groups, to these different arms of this that maybe you were curious about 10 years ago or even within this office?
Well, I feel like I have a good understanding of what went wrong and how this happened, and then a good understanding of the sort of accidents that went right at the end that resulted in the resolution of the manhunt. But what I don't know is how it is that for 3 weeks these government leaders managed to keep their folks working so hard, so intently, for such long hours under difficult circumstances, way out in the muddy woods of the North Country, and to keep them going, while at the same time, of course, continuing to run the Department of Corrections, continuing to run the state police, and in our case, continuing to run the many other demands on the state offices of the Inspector General. I think it is a fascinating study in leadership, and I'm excited to have that part of the conversation with them as well.
And we have you coming on after the fact at some point to discuss all of that with us. So we're really excited to continue these conversations and learn more about what you learned and what it looks like moving forward. But thank you so much, Inspector General Lucy Lang. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tom, for having me on. And I remind all New Yorkers who suspect fraud or corruption in state government to report it to us at 1-800-DO-RIGHT and follow us on social media at New York State IG.
Thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button right now so you can stay up to date on these news-making conversations about the issues impacting New Yorkers the most: power and politics.